Welcome. My name is Rebecca Martin. I'm the Director of Education and Guest Experiences at Gunston Hall. We are thrilled to have you with us for our second installment in our Decorative Arts Symposium, Dissent Made Material, and we are very honored tonight to have Barbara Brackman with us to talk with us about the threads of dissent.
Here I am. All right, we'll see how this works. Now I'm going to share my screen, and I should have a slideshow here. Things look like they're going well. Okay. Well, I am a quilt historian, amateur, and I have loved quilts nearly all my life. And I also am very interested in how quilts tell us about women's history. So we're going to look at some quilts and some other needlework that talks about how women fought slavery in the 19th century. Now, I know I'm sort of the 19th century representative here. Oh, look at this. So that goes there. Oh, there it goes. And we're going to talk about quilts that made money for the cause and also that raised awareness, and a few that might have pricked the slaveholders' conscience. We'll go back to this beautiful silk quilt later on, but I spent a lot of time looking at this quilt over the years, and so have a lot of other people. We really didn't understand quite what it was. And what we found is that a lot of times when we're looking at these anti-slavery textiles, that they are really not what they seem, that our initial assumptions are often wrong. And then also we see a lot of things that we probably wish we hadn't. And that's just the imagery is just a little bit offensive to our eyes today. So we're going to go and we're going to talk about quilts made in the northern states. Now, I'm not going to be able to show you any southern anti-slavery quilts. That just is not going to be here. And I want to remind you, though, that slavery took place in the northern states until the 19th century. Some states, like New York, forbid it in 1799. Pennsylvania was one of the first to forbid slavery in 1780, and so was Massachusetts. But other places like New Jersey let it go on till 1804. And in fact, I've read about people in New Jersey who were still considered slaves into the 1820s and 30s. So when we think about slavery and these textiles, we have to remember that people were fighting against slavery in northern states too. And that's where we're going to see most of these textiles coming from. There are a lot of important dates. Oh, I see I've got one wrong here. Slavery was prohibited in Pennsylvania in 1780. But what we'll find is that many of these threads of anti-slavery started in the 18th century. The Pennsylvania Quakers were the first to form an anti-slavery society. And in fact, as far as I can tell, the first in the world to actually start an activist society. And British Quakers, the Quakers were among those people, of course, who were most conscience-ridden by this. British Quakers petitioned Parliament, and pretty soon people started formal anti-slavery organizations. And one of the things that they did was, as I said, they wanted to raise consciousness. They developed a logo that was incredibly effective. And you can see the white medallion, it's China, jasperware, there on the right. That was made by the Wedgwood pottery people. And they publicized their fight with this image of a man kneeling in chains. And we will see it over and over again in some of these textiles. Now, Americans, as I said, the Quakers were the first who started these formal anti-slavery societies, but there was always a problem with women's participation. Women were not permitted really to talk in meetings. They were not permitted to lecture to men. They were not permitted to really have any active say. And so they rebelled by forming their own societies. And we have the early female anti-slavery societies that start in the 1820s and 30s. So I have these dates up here and we'll go back to them, but I won't go on too much about them. Here we have the anti-slavery image again. One of the things that the women did was they adapted it to be a female slave. And so in 1830 or so, you start seeing these African-American women with chains. They're slightly different from the men. The way to discriminate is that they have a longer skirt. But sometimes they will say, am I not a woman and a sister? Whereas the male version would say, am I not a man and a brother? And once this logo was developed, you'll see it on needlework quite a bit. That pincushion at the bottom, as far as I can tell, I'm not a knitter, but that is a knitted pincushion, and it was made at the Ackworth Quaker School in England. Why? I don't know. Whether it was to sell or whether it was an exercise for a small girl in not only knitting, but in sympathy and empathy and politics, we're not sure. But the Ackworth Quaker School did do a lot of anti-slavery, small things, samplers and pincushions and things like that. As I say, this image was incredibly effective. I think it started out over on the top right, there's a metal oval. I think it started out as from Wedgeworth as a stamp. You know, people would seal a letter or seal a document with a piece of wax. And I think the image first came to sort of let your correspondents know that you were anti-slavery. You would stamp that image into the wax. But it quickly became widespread in everything. And some of my favorite things, since I love dishes, would be, if I could afford it, would be the anti-slavery sugar bowls down here. And because slaves were so involved in this sugar industry, many Quakers and many other anti-slavery people would not eat a sugar from the West Indies, from the Caribbean. And so they had a special sugar bowl that would be a different kind of a sugar that did not involve slave labor. And so Wedgwood and many other companies did a lot of business in making these anti-slavery sugar bowls. And then we also see them as decorative items, a pin with gold chains there. And a lot of people had them as tokens, and sometimes those tokens would have a hole in it where you might wear it on your coat. Because raising people's consciousness, letting people know that you were anti-slavery was the important thing. Now, I would go back to the Ackworth School again, or to the samplers, I guess. That sampler in the middle has the image of the kneeling male slave. And we don't know much about it. It says Stickney, and it says peace to my friend. And under there, it might be a date, but it's 18-2. So my guess is it's before 1832, probably 22, maybe a little earlier than that. But you see how important that particular image was in needlework. And these are samplers. We'll talk a little bit about samplers in a minute. But people were either very skilled at portraying a picture, as you can see in some of them, or else they were not the least bit skilled. And the difference might be rather the skill level of the needleworker, but more the skill level of the pattern maker. It's amazing to me how typical these are, how they seem to follow a formula. And here we have two, one very simple and one very sophisticated. Now the one at the bottom is signed Hannah Bloor, 1840, which is fairly late. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I've just always, looking at these, assumed that someone named Hannah Bloor was very interested in anti-slavery and either was taught to do this as a child or did it herself later on. But most of these are schoolgirl kinds of things. But I realize now as I look at these closer that some of my first impressions about schoolgirl embroidery and these schoolgirl samplers are probably wrong. And if you're not a sampler aficionado, I really don't know much about samplers, but I do know that there's two kinds of this embroidered imagery. One is the earlier style, which is a cross stitch with, say, wool or silk, maybe a linen background. And you can see the image on the left, and I've got a detail of the tree and the chain there. A lot of times these are embroidered and the background is left the plain fabric. And that's an embroidered sampler kind of concept. So you don't fill in the background. But later, Berlin work or what we would call needlepoint became more fashionable. So the one on the right with the Latin motto that reads, "While I breathe, I hope." I have no idea where that came from, just found it like at an auction on the internet. But that is what we would call needlepoint, and the entire background is filled in. So that is sewn over a canvas, and you don't want to leave the background empty because you have this canvas showing. Whereas you can, on a sampler, you can leave the background plain, and you've got that beautiful piece of linen or sometimes wool, various things. I've even seen them as sort of linsey woolsey backgrounds. Here we have two of the later needlepoint or Berlin work style. Now the one on the right is very nicely dated for us. And that is very interesting, one of a kind. I have never seen the front view of the kneeling female slave. And that says contraband, and you may be familiar with Black history and realize that during the Civil War, when it first began, Lincoln and some of his generals decided to call freed slaves the contraband of war. And that was how they justified being able to take what the South was calling private property. Because if the rebels were fighting, their property could be confiscated. And everybody used the term contraband. So that seems to be a Civil War idea. One of the latest of these samplers or embroidered pictures that I've seen. And over on the left is another completely filled in background. And it's from the National Maritime Museum in England. And they think it's 1820, but I wonder if it's not a little bit later because Berlin work was so fashionable later. But again, I'm not an embroidery historian. The oldest one that I have seen, the oldest sampler that I have seen is 1803. And this one is in Colonial Williamsburg. And I put the label right over the poem because you can't see the poem anyway, it's faded away. But this is a girl who was 14, 1803. She wrote a poem on her sampler. And the poem is from William Cooper, it's over on the left. You often see people taking published sentiment, published poetry, published quotes, and putting them into their samplers. Now, if you're not familiar with ornamental needlework, there were two purposes. One, it was ornamental. You could put it in your living room. It showed that your daughter was a very talented needleworker, as you can see on the right in that cartoon with the ladies embroidering and talking about it. So that was ornamental in that sense. But also on the left, you see the girl, 18th century girl. She was making something that was ornamental, but she also was ornamental. It was very important that girls grew into women that were polite, that followed the rules, and sat quietly working at their needlework in their proper sphere. And so the needlework and these samplers were ornamental in two ways. One, you could look at them, and you could also watch the maker as she sewed, because she was an ornament too. I have not seen a sampler now that I really feel is American with that kind of image on it, with that slave kneeling. This one is from the, again, I've showed you this one before, from the Ackworth School, a Quaker school. It's a Quaker style sampler with the kind of random shapes sprinkled across it. We did have, in Westtown, Pennsylvania, we had a very good Quaker school with a great embroidery and needlework tradition. but I have not seen any American samplers with that kneeling slave. So down there I have the Westtown School in Pennsylvania from the early 19th century, but it's just the same style. It doesn't have the image. And these were very often monochrome, but here's one from Ackworth from 1801 that's multicolored. Someone sent me this picture. She had inherited this picture from her mother, and she lived in England. And she wondered if it was American or English. And at the time, I mean, I still don't know. It's certainly not as well done as some of these. And what is the purpose? Is it a schoolgirl sampler? Is it a part of something? And it's framed. Now, the mother who had the woman that talked to me, her mother was an antique dealer, antique collector. So it's not a family piece, but it's certainly, it has the images of the little angels and the idea of the star, and of course the kneeling slave. And then the idea of the Negro's prayer, which is really just one line there. So when she asked me about this is how I sort of got into these embroidered things. I thought, well, I'll find out what I can. So I'm still confused about this one, but it seems to be related to that English tradition. Now we can move ahead into 1840. Women were still having problems being heard. And in 1840, they had a World Anti-Slavery Convention in England. And I love this one because women were not allowed. Now here we have a painting with sort of composite, but there are women in the audience. But it was just so galling that people were not permitted, women were not permitted to actually take part in these things. And you see it, as I said earlier, you see these women's organizations forming so that women can have a voice and be heard. One of the earliest ones was in Birmingham, England, where ladies formed the Ladies Society for the Relief of Negro Slaves. They later shortened that name. And I think this was quite an important group. Elizabeth Coltman Hyrick there is one of the women behind it. And we're going to see things, some of the needlework that they did. Now, Sarah Moore Grimke was an American, and she became a Quaker. She was from a slaveholding South Carolina family. She became a Quaker and moved to Philadelphia. And she was a great writer and really a great speaker too. And she's the one that talked a lot about how women were using their needles, their paintbrushes, and their pens to labor assiduously to keep the suffering of the slave continually before the public. And I think it's interesting here that she talks about their needles, their paintbrushes, and their pens. And we'll see, this form is something that one might look at these initially and think these are inked, that this was someone's pen, that someone with a real talent was copying something onto silk. And what we're looking at here are work bags, or what were called reticules, purses. And there are many, many of these in museum collections around the world. Most are attributed to that Birmingham Ladies Society, and they're thought to date from about 1825 or later. And they had a real function. They carried your things, but they were sort of a little poster, maybe a very discreet sandwich board that raised consciousness, and women were encouraged to carry them openly with the image on their hand, and then people might know that they were anti-slavery and might inquire and would give you a chance to get to talk about the topic. So we have them, as I said, all over the world in museum collections. Some of them are very sophisticated, are made with hardware and chains, like the one over on the right is from the Fashion Institute in Los Angeles. Very sophisticated reticule handbag, and some of them are just gathered silk, like I think the two at the bottom left on the green ground are from the DAR Museum. But they have they repeat the same imagery. So at first I thought perhaps these are inked, but then I realized that they're probably printed. And what you could do, you go to your local print shop, your newspaper, and you could take some kind of a plate in there and they would print on fabric for you. So here I have two, the same one from the Los Angeles Fashion Institute Museum, and then one that's from Princeton. Very simple cotton one that's just gathered. But both of them are printed onto cotton or printed onto silk. And so my thinking here is that in Birmingham, England, they had plates that they took to the printer and printed yards and yards of this imagery. So here's a few more. Some of them are in good shape. Silk has a tendency to disintegrate if you're rough on it and it doesn't get the proper storage. But again, we see rather sophisticated chains and clasps and things like that. So it's interesting that there is such a wide range of skill level in making these bags. I have one here that the one on the bottom looks to be cotton, and again, very simple. The one on the left is silk and gathered. And then the one with the beads is in French and is in the Lynn Museum in Massachusetts. So what we're seeing here is this, this idea of showing off your thinking by what you're wearing. Also, because the internet's so great now, I never knew where that imagery was from, but now I just poked around a little bit and I found that there was a pamphlet from Birmingham in 1825, which is when we think these handbags were begun. And the imagery in that little pamphlet, which is just their report on their doings, is the same thing that you see on the handbags. They advised you to carry it. As I said, over on the left, you see a woman carrying a bag. I have no idea what LEOB means. Maybe it's her initials. But as I said, these are kind of little walking posters, and hopefully someone might inquire and you can make a convert. The whole idea of printing that imagery on fabric is also interesting. I had not considered that this was an option until I read more about print shops and textiles. But you do see a few different images on silk and on muslin. The quilt on the left has a piece of fairly coarse silk with that image of the kneeling slave, but it's a different image than those Birmingham purses. And then there's a silk handkerchief there too, where someone has taken the piece of silk and had a plate printed onto it in a print shop. This goes back to the quilt. This is quite an impressive piece. It's all silk. It's made by a Quaker. Quakers would not wear cotton because it was a slave commodity. And so they wore simple silks. Deborah Coates was married to a very important person in the American anti-slavery movement. So perhaps this was a gift for her husband, or just something that reflected her own thinking. Unfortunately, she had two children or two grandchildren, and they could not agree on who was going to get it. So they cut it down the middle. So that's why there's a line right down the middle of both the quilt and the image. Now, maybe 40 years ago, someone in the family showed it to Linda Ruther and Julie Silver, and they had decided they would put it back together. So they had these two skinny quilts that were bound, and when they took the binding off in the center, they saw this image. They had never noticed it because it was in the binding, in the edge of the quilt. So they put it back together. It's now in the Lancaster Heritage Center, I think. But one of the very few quilts I've seen actually with these printed silks in them. What you mostly see the printed silks on are the handbags. Here's another one with the image of the kneeling slave, but this one's inked in. And this is the woman rather than the man. This is made for Sarah Wister, who was from Philadelphia, and her friend Rebecca Hart inked that image on there. It's perhaps this Sarah Wister, you know, Wister's a common name in Philadelphia. This Sarah Wister, who never married and was obviously very interested in the anti-slavery cause. This quilt belongs to the International Quilt Study Center, and they have done some work on Sarah Wister, and I think that we probably have identified her here. I like it that when Sarah Wister died, I found her, the listing of her death certificate, and it said she died of exhaustion from old age, which everyone can relate to. What I haven't seen is quilts that are made from commercially produced fabric that's anti-slave. Now, there would have been several sources. If you decided you wanted to make a quilt in 1830, you could perhaps cut up the curtains, this toile print, which was called the slave trade, and depicted all, as toiles often do, very many kind of vignettes of the slave trade, of what people being caught, people being sold, the tragedy of the whole thing. And there are many examples of this surviving piece of fabric, but they're always bedspreads, bed curtains. I haven't ever seen it in a quilt, which kind of surprised me. This piece belongs to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it came in many colors. So that was an option, is you could find a commercially printed piece of fabric that would give you an anti-slavery message. There were handkerchiefs made for children. These were kind of teaching handkerchiefs. And I'm surprised also that I've never seen any evidence anybody ever cut one of these up and put it into a quilt. I mean, it's just asking for it, So these handkerchiefs were often used as teaching tools, of course, always used as teaching tools, but often sent down into the South. And I remember reading that someone in a post office in the South way before the Civil War found a crate of these being shipped down to down south, and there was quite a kerfuffle about it, trying to corrupt the minds of the Southern child with these teaching handkerchiefs. But not, as far as I so far have seen, I've never seen one cut up and put into a patchwork quilt. The only image that I have here of someone cutting up a commercial piece of fabric is this one, which was from an auction. It looks like maybe a snuff box or some kind of little decorative box. And that textile shows Liberty, and she is picking up a slave who's burst his chains. It looks like it's woven design rather than printed. And as far as I know, so far, this is the only one I've seen where someone's taken a commercial piece of fabric and modified it, changed it, and made it into something else. So this might have been sold at an anti-slavery fair or just someone's own personal image. We have to talk, of course, about the anti-slavery fair, the bazaar. And women who are interested in raising funds, raising any kind of awareness to change the world, funded a good deal of what they did with fairs, ladies' fairs, often held at Christmas, in which you would come, like this woman here, and buy all sorts of little handmade items. She's got a purse in her hand. Now, there's some question as to whether James Collinson meant this was her purse and it had nothing in it because she'd spent all her money, or whether she was thinking about buying this particular purse at the bazaar. But it was very commonly used method of raising funds. And as Sarah Grimke tells us in 1836, that there were already in 1836, 60 female anti-slavery organizations in the United States. And they were presenting this kneeling image constantly before the public eye on bags, needle books, card racks, pen wipers, pincushions. What she's saying is that we're making these things they're making the pincushions, the card racks, the pen wipers to sell at these anti-slavery fairs. And there are several, I wouldn't say many, but several surviving pincushions that, again, we have an image printed on a piece of fabric. I think this is a piece of cotton. It might be silk. But these were handmade and then put into these anti-slavery fairs and sold for the cause. Here's another form of pincushion. It's called a pinwheel. You know, pinwheel we think of as a firework, but a pinwheel was a round cardboard item, two sort of sandwiched together like an Oreo cookie, and you stuck the pins all around the perimeter there, and it was called a pinwheel. And they were easy to make. And again, we have someone who has printed the image of the kneeling slave onto cotton. And on the back of this, with the one on the left, which is the National Maritime Museum in England, is a little advertisement that they seem to have taken from a newspaper or something similar. The DAR Museum has one that's also a pinwheel that's also similar, but it's the female slave with the longer skirt. And I showed you that one there that way. I see again that some of these images that we're seeing on these, like the DARs, are taken from that Birmingham report, the imagery there. So that might be an English item that was sent over to the United States to be sold at a fair. I would imagine that many crates of English handwork, those purses, all those reticules, and a lot of pincushions came over for the American fairs. It was one way that the British who could help in the cause over here. Here's another image of a pincushion. Now, I've never seen one of these, but Sarah talks about it. Sarah Grimke talks about it. Some pincushions were made in the form of shoes, and on the sole was written, "Trample not on the oppressed." So I have never seen one, but I can imagine what it might look like. Here, Godey's tells you how to make a little shoe pincushion or a needle case. So all from about 1835 up until the Civil War, women in both England and America raised their money, as I said, through these fairs, these bazaars. But there's just so many small things you can sell. And so here in Salem, Ohio, by 1848, after 10 or 12 years of this, having a fair every Christmas, the newspaper editor seems to be a little weary. If you can read that, you can see he's trying to make it more interesting. But you could buy bed quilts, baby socks, dolls, needlebooks, pincushions, reticules, bookmarks, all with an anti-slavery message. Now, this quilt belongs to Historic New England. They've had it for quite a while. They really were not too aware of what it was when they sort of found it in collections 50 years ago. But we have an example of a quilt with a poem on it that is anti-slavery, and you can read the poem down there. I have given this lecture so many times, I even have it still memorized. Think of the Negro mother when her child is torn away and sold for a little slave. Oh, then for that poor mother pray. And I have actually made a copy of this quilt, inked that poem on there myself. So we have the quilt, and then many years ago, Questa Benberry noticed. Questa was a historian of African American needlework and quilts. She found an account in the Liberator, the anti-slavery American newspaper, of the Boston Ladies' Fair in 1836 that had exactly the same poem mentioned. So there's the poem. We have a quilt, a newspaper account, and then Questa found a letter. Now, Lydia Maria Child was one of the leaders of the anti-slavery movement in New England and in the United States. And right after the Christmas Fair of 1836, she wrote a letter and said, "You've doubtless heard of the success of our fair." And this was one of the first fairs in the United States. And her cradle quilt sold for $5, which was considerable. So here we have a letter. And I've done some work. Questa died maybe 10 years ago, and she would love the internet, so because she could find out so much more. I found out who it was sold to, the $5, the Jacksons of Boston, who were a rich anti-slavery family, and then the children it covered and how they became anti-slavery. And in fact, one of them was a big fan of John Brown and went to Kansas, which with the John Brown people. So it's got a lengthy story. The poem we found, a lot of people thought that maybe Lydia Marie Child had written that poem, but her friend Eliza Cabot Follen actually wrote the poem, and she had published it beforehand. And so now we know the source of the poem. Charlotte Fortin Grimke, another Grimke, but from the same family, was born a free Black woman in Philadelphia. And she moved to Salem, Massachusetts, because they had schools that would let Black children go to them. In Philadelphia, she was still discriminated against. So she went to Salem, and she had a wonderful time as late as 1854 or something in there, 1856, at the fair. And she mentioned that she ran into Mrs. Follen and Mrs. Child, the woman who made the quilt, and then Mrs. Chapman, who was in charge of the fairs in general, sort of the power behind these fairs. And I like it to think of these women kind of hanging out and going to their fairs. And Charlotte was thrilled that they were so nice to her, because, you know, people often were not nice to Charlotte as a black girl. So she was always wrote down when people in her diary when people were kind to her. So we have this particular quilt. We can conclude that it is the quilt that Lydia Marie Child made for that fair. And but I wish we had more of these. Now I think there probably are more. We're just not aware. We're not looking at them close enough. This is a quilt from the Quilt Index. They did the Quilt Index has thousands and thousands of quilts that were documented by state projects, and the Massachusetts State Quilt Project found this one in the Hingham Historical Society. And there's very little doubt that this was an anti-slavery quilt, because it's inked all over with anti-slavery messages. So what we assume it's a crib quilt, might have been sold at a fair. It's hard to know, you know, this is so obvious, the symbolism and the imagery. There was another quilt sold at a fair. Maria Weston Chapman there was, as I said, was in charge of the fair. She was really the woman behind all those New England fairs. And she published a little booklet down there. And she writes that she had gotten a quilt from England, from a woman named Margaret Brackman, and Margaret had made a silk quilt, and it sold immediately, and there's no photo of it. So I'm just showing you what it might have looked like up there. But Margaret, you know, where Margaret's quilt is today, we don't know. The imagery and is probably not obvious, but Margaret sent it with a little note that she found a lot of symbolism in there. She decided to count all the stitches in her quilt. And after she did it with multiplication, she decided that there were 20 times as many slaves in America as there are stitches in my quilt. So things like that kind of imagery, that kind of, rather than imagery, that kind of symbolism is something that there's no way that we can recapture. We don't know what happened to Margaret's quilt, but Maria did mention that it sold for a good price. Here's another silk quilt, a full-size quilt, I think. I don't think this is a crib quilt, in a Massachusetts museum, the Royal House Museum, which is an old Massachusetts home that is so old that has slave quarters. So it was built during the time when slavery was legal in Massachusetts. So I assume that because of that, slave quarters and their mission to tell the slave story, that over the years they've been given quilts that have really nothing to do with Royal House, but do have something to do with the abolitionist cause. And this star quilt just has this one little printed piece of silk in the bottom. It says "Plead for the Slave." Again, it looks like something that was not inked onto the silk, but printed at a print shop. They also have at Royal House Museum another one that is inked. And this is one of the problems with inking. The ink that people were using in the mid-19th century oxidized, and sometimes it rusted away as it picked up oxygen from the air. And so that's probably what's happened here, is that the ink itself has a tendency to rot. So I can't read this, and no one's been able to figure it out yet. But it seems to be a quilt that was made for a minister and his wife, and it does have anti-slavery sentiments on some of the blocks, although I don't have good pictures of everything. But there's another one that is obvious as to what its intent was. It might have been sold at a fair. It might have been just a gift for someone who was active in the anti-slavery cause. And speaking of gifts, when the Massachusetts Project was looking for quilts, they came across this one at the Worcester Historical Museum, and on it, it says that it was made in Princeton, or Everettville in Princeton, Massachusetts. And they didn't know much about it in the museum, didn't have great history with it, but they said it was associated with Abby Foster Kelly, or Abby Kelly Foster. I never can get her name right. But Abby was a very important speaker in the American anti-slavery cause, someone who gave many, many speeches, and we would assume someone might make a quilt for her. But I was wondering and looking for more anti-slavery information. I found more information, and makes me think that the quilt was not made for Abby, but was made for this man, Jonathan Walker. And I have back here, I think that Jonathan Walker is this man right here, although these people are not identified, but he certainly has the same hairline and the same eyes, kind of compelling eyes there as in this portrait. Now, Jonathan Walker was quite well known. He was an anti-slavery activist, and he freed slaves if he could. And he went into Florida once too often, and he was arrested. And they branded his hand with the SS for slave stealer. Now, this is the daguerreotype, so it's backwards, but his hand looked like that, and that hand was quite an effective image. Jonathan, like many of these anti-slavery speakers, was rather poor, and he had a family of several children. I think that the quilt that they associate with Abby Foster was probably made for him. It's so worn that you really can't see it. I drew up what I think it might look like. So he wrote to the Liberator a letter of thanks in 1847, and he said, after he got out of jail and he got back to his house in Plymouth, he found that people had made a quilt for his family, which is a very sweet thing to do. And I'm sure they were very glad to have something warm. And he also mentioned that it was women in Everettville who'd made it. So we have a quilt from Everettville with not much history, and we have a mention of a quilt made by ladies in Everettville. So I would guess that probably is the source. Here's his hand. It was used over and over again as another image that really affected people, but I have not seen this image in any textiles. Then we have all the lost quilts, the imaginary quilts. And in this case, this is a quilt that was supposed to be made for Abby Kelly Foster, and people raised some money, during a fair, but a terrible thing happened. The floor of the hall gave way, and everything was, lost. And the worst thing that happened was looters came in and stole all the money they'd raised for the quilt for Abby Kelly Foster. So I don't know if they'd actually found a quilt for her, and or they were just planning to buy one. Here's another one that's lost. This in Ohio, they made a quilt dedicated to William Lloyd Garrison and showed it at their fair. Someone paid $16, and I assume they sent it to William Lloyd Garrison, but I can't find this one either. It's just gone. Now these people, as I said, were poor and they had a lot of kids, so that's the end of it. This is the saddest one to me. In Concord, Massachusetts, the Alcotts, Louisa May and her family, were very kind to take in two of John Brown's daughters. After their father was hung, they came to stay in Concord. They went to the liberal school there, the forward-thinking school, and they boarded at the Alcotts. And when they got to town, Sophia Thoreau, Henry's sister, and her mother gave a party for them, and they had spent some time before the girls got there making a quilt. And they called it their John Brown Memorial, and it had an appropriate inscription on each block. But that quilt's not around either. And I think that Annie, married later, and I think she had 10 kids. So that's probably the end of that quilt too. But someday it might show up, a John Brown Memorial. Now here's another thing that isn't what it seemed. This one I thought was made by Maria Baldwin Hollander out of her sympathy for the anti-slavery cause. Quite an elegant quilt, all silk with another poem. Poems were, of course, very important. And it belongs to historic New England also. But what I found was with Maria, she made it for her Crystal Palace exhibit. And she didn't make it. I shouldn't even say that. She hired a woman to make it for her. So here we have her exhibit at the Crystal Palace, the World's Fair in 1853 and 4. And she's got a big glass display case. She was a commercial children's clothing manufacturer, ready-made children's clothing, quite high price and high prestige children's clothing. And she obviously was a very anti-slavery. And in her display at the fair, trying to sell her clothing, she had this quilt on display. And I assume, see with the man in the top hat there, the tall man with the dark top hat, I think this quilt was hanging behind the clothing. You can see the back of something that looks quite a bit like a quilt. This was quite a hit. People were very, very interested in it at the World's Fair, and it made all the newspapers. So we have lots of descriptions of it. But she really did not make it. She hired someone in England to make it, a woman who was a professional needleworker, and she paid her $100, which was quite a bit of money at the time. And of course, there's quite a bit of work in it too. So this is something that was sort of part of the women's work, the commercial network of making needlework. We tend to always look at this as craft and folk art, but this is commercial art. So back to the embroideries. I want to go through these pretty quickly. What I learned in looking at some of the embroideries is I found a lot of almost identical samplers. Same imagery, and they have words like emancipated on them. So these are two almost identical items. York Castle Museum has one very similar, Emancipated, Sarah Sedgwick. What I found in looking at these is that they were not made, as I assumed, by a child perhaps who had been an emancipated slave in America or the West Indies, but they were made in Africa. And there are many of them around as different images. Here's one that's in, well, what's it? I don't know where I don't think I have the actual cred there, but they were made in Sierra Leone in West Africa. And Sierra Leone was a port. The slave trade was illegal. England had outlawed it for their commercial endeavors, but people continued to fight that. And so part of the English Navy's job was to capture these slave ships. And when they captured them, they often were full of children, and their children were put into missionary homes. So they were emancipated. They were called recaptured because they were captured from slavery and put into orphanages where they were trained in various kinds of needlework and various, the hope was that these children who had no idea where they were from at the time would be able to go back into their home tribes, their homelands, and be Christian missionaries. Now, what I also had heard that Kim Ivey give a lecture at this on these Native American samplers that are very related. They're signed Nancy Graves. She's a Cherokee. She's going to the mission school in Tennessee. But that is really, heavens, I've really lost a lot here. That is really not her name. What I found was that these missionaries I don't have everything here. Either I skipped them or sometimes, things just disappear. But anyway, I'll tell you what happened was that these children were emancipated from the slave ships. They couldn't go back to their parents. So they went to these missionary schools. They had to support them. And someone got the idea that there would be, that you could invest in a child. If you gave a pretty good amount of money, £5 a year for 5 years, to these schools in Sierra Leone, they would name a child for you. So the child who had been taken off the slave ship then lost her name and became, say, Hannah Blore or Sarah Sedgwick, named for the woman or who was sending the money to support the school. And then as a gift, that little girl would be taught to do a schoolgirl sampler, and she would send that to the woman. They shared the common name. And those women were in Germany, they were in the United States, they were in England. And so these samplers wind up all over the world, but they seem to have been made in Africa and specifically in Sierra Leone. There's different forms. The ones with the kneeling slave, I just haven't seen in that anybody's really done any work on them, but they look as if someone has got a pattern. Some teacher's got a pattern and she's having everybody do the same thing. These are the Native American ones. They use the same method of funding for these Native American schools, the boarding schools, where they would change a girl's name and name her for someone who was supporting the school, and then she would make them a sampler as a gift. So we go to the end of the 19th century. I start seeing this kind of tasteless goodbye Dixie imagery. These were potholders, and they began apparently in the 1860s as something you'd buy at an anti-slavery fair, or in the 1860s at a union fundraising fair for the Sanitary Commission, and they've been traced to Chicago in about 1864. So these are done on a canvas. As I say, it's kind of the whole thing's kind of tasteless, but it was a very popular image. You see it over and over again in these potholders. Any holder but a slaveholder. It's a pun, you get it. So these come out of the Great Northwestern Fair in Chicago, and there's quite a few of these. As we go into the rest of the century, even after slavery was over, we still see these ornamental items being embroidered. They were often done on punch cardboard, which is a very common embroidery for kids. It was when I was a kid. I used to do this. So it gets very strange. It gets very strange. And the emphasis here is that we are free, and there's a celebration. One of the latest ones I've seen is this one that says "We's gwine north" or "Goodbye Dixie." And I wonder if the "Goodbye Dixie" and the "We's free" doesn't reflect something of the exoduster movement. In Kansas, we have several towns that were founded by people from the South, freed slaves who came and got free land. I wonder if the imagery is not from a very popular play called Out of Bondage. And you know, it must have been a blackface minstrel kind of thing that would offend us no end. But one of the lines in there was, we're going north, we is, and we ain't gonna work no more. Well, if you went out to Western Kansas, you were gonna work, I'll tell you that. But here's a embroidery that has exactly the same line from that Out of Bondage, sort of a catchphrase from a popular culture. And these were bookmarks. As I say, these were parlor ornaments, and they weren't that sensitive, shall we say. Now, there's still room for more, of course, much more work in this. I think a lot of museums might have anti-slavery quilts, but they haven't read them carefully. They look at them as album quilts, and sometimes the inscriptions are hard to read. And also, I think the records of these anti-slavery societies might tell us quite a bit about what kind of needlework was being made. And as I say, there's just dozens and dozens of these mid-century album quilts. And I think if we were careful and read what was in them, we might find more anti-slavery quilts. We might someday even find that John Brown memorial that Henry Thoreau's mother and sister made for the girls, which would be, you know, too wonderful. So I'm going to stop my share because that's all I have to say. And here I am. So I imagine you might have questions or comments.
Thank you. Barbara, that was amazing. My head is spinning. You have so many gorgeous images and so much information. I am going to be reflecting on this for quite a while. There's a lot there, and it was really incredible. I do want to mention to everyone in the audience that if you, like me, find that there is some information that you'd like to revisit, never fear. We will be posting the recording of Barbara's talk on our Facebook page right here and also on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to revisit any of the images that that Barbara has shared and to hear some of the stories again. I know that I will be watching again because there's so much to take in. So thank you. We do have a few questions, and so I'd like to pass along some of those questions. One of them regards people who were enslaved and the needlework that they might have done. Have you encountered any examples of needlework from people who were enslaved?
Oh, certainly. And that would be a whole nother topic. And we have not only surviving examples, we can trace the name on there to a specific woman. We also have many, many accounts in written material at the time. You know, some of my favorites are when people would move away from a plantation, the white family, and someone would write a letter back to from home, and the slaves would all ask to be remembered, and because of course they couldn't write, but they would dictate, and they'd say, tell her that we had a quilting last week and we got 2 done. You know, that kind of chatting, and quilting was very much a part of slave life, but that's a whole nother topic, and it might be a 2-hour lecture.
And then we've had a couple of, excuse me just a moment. We've had a couple of other questions that I'd like to pass along. One of them relates to 18th century anti-slavery. We know that there wasn't a lot of anti-slavery work that was in the 18th century, that it wasn't until the end of the 18th century that people started to gather together in abolitionist groups. Have you encountered any 18th century textiles that have abolitionist messages?
Well, of course, dating, if it doesn't have a date on it, you know, things move slowly. Fads didn't happen so fast. But the earliest is that sampler. I think it was 1802 or something, English sampler. No, but the kneeling slave, the pottery, that is, I think, 1780s. So you would hope. But I think it really took some organized groups like those women in Birmingham to make those reticules over and over and over again. You know, it took some women getting good at organizing. First, they had to say, all right, they won't let me talk. I think we'll start our own group. Then what are we going to do all day in our group besides mutter about how they won't let us talk? So I think it took some organization that probably you don't see until the 18 teens, 20s, 30s. That's my guess.
That makes sense. And then you mentioned that we've lost so many of these quilts, we imagine, because of their use. Do you think that some of the ones that have survived were just kept as precious treasures and were never used? Is that how they were able to survive? What's your feeling about, do you think they were all used?
Well, I showed you several quilts, but they all look like they'd been worn. And some of them look like they'd really been worn. The one that Lydia Murray Child made that she sold to the Jacksons for her $5, they reflect in the family that they put that around the babies. The kids were raised under that quilt. So I think that most of them were used, and I'm sure many were used up. Many were used up. And then textiles, they're kind of ephemeral. They need care, and especially if they're silk, they need they just disintegrate. So,
well, I think it's amazing how many examples you've been able to find. I mean, it's pretty incredible to me how much has survived. So we're quite lucky in that regard.
Yes.
Well, good. Thank you so very, very much for this really wonderful overview of the needlework that you've been able to find. And again, if anyone is interested in seeing the presentation, again, it will be on our Facebook page, and it will be on the Gunston Hall YouTube channel. There have been some questions I know about whether we might do a program especially on needleworks done by people who were enslaved or by people of color. It would be a wonderful.
I'm not the authority on that.
Well, I'd like to mention that just yesterday, we actually hosted a program in conjunction with colleagues at Winterthur Museum and Garden. The program is on the exhibition representing Black womanhood that Winterthur had in person and is now online at Winterthur's website. And in that exhibition, there are several examples of schoolgirl needleworks that were done by girls who were Black. They were going to schools that were specifically for Black girls. And then there's some other needleworks also that seem to have been done by Black women. And that's just a really, really wonderful example of some information that's available right now. So that program, again, from yesterday is on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And so please look for that Collecting Rights program if you're interested in learning more about needleworks done by Black women in the 19th century. Otherwise, I want to make sure that I invite everyone back to our third segment of the Dissent Made Material program, which will be next week. Barbara has very nicely taken us through the 19th century. We're going to venture into the 20th century to see some examples of handmade objects that carry messages of dissent. And in this case, they're going to be all gifts that were given to President Reagan. They're in the collection of the Reagan Library. And Jennifer Torres, the registrar at the Ronald Reagan Library, is going to tell us all about some of those gifts that carry a message of dissent. So I do hope everyone will visit us next week at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the program on Thursday. See you then. In other news,